Mm-hmm. I think I just did.
Welcome, everybody. Well, it's a pleasure to kick off this semester's keynote series with the lecture this evening by Matthew Pratt Guterl. But this is also a kind of new moment for us where it concludes our, let's say, thesis exhibition, and where topically the lecture and project thesis sort of aligns. So I'm very glad that we're able to set this new precedent. Matthew is the L. Herbert Ballou University Professor of Africana Studies and American Studies at Brown University. Born and raised in central New Jersey, he earned his BA from Richard Stockton University and his PhD in history from Rutgers. He was the winner of the 2010 Mary C. Turpie Prize, given by the American Studies Association for distinguished teaching, service, and program development in that field. He's a Rutgers 250 Distinguished Alumni, a recipient of the Distinguished Alumni Award from Richard Stockton University, an OAH Distinguished Lecturer, and he received the President's Award for Excellence in Faculty Governance at Brown. An award-winning historian, he has also written The Color of Race in America, 1900 to 1940, American Mediterranean, Southern Slaveholders in the Age of Emancipation, Seeing Race in Modern America, and Josephine Baker and the Rainbow Tribe. But the reason why he is lecturing today is because of a book he co-authored with Caroline Lavender, a book on the social meaning of the modern hotel entitled Hotel Life. So in full disclosure, it is this book that really started to set the tone for the development of a project thesis and the hotel. So for all of you who want to know what my footnote reference would be, this is the major one. So the story comes around a year later. So I'm very pleased to have you here with us. Matthew, coming all the way from Providence to be here in the snowy weather. I'm very pleased to have you kick off this series with a more intellectual or scholarly focused lecture, and to conclude this kind of interesting body of work. So thank you for sharing your scholarship on the hotel, and we look forward to hearing your story. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Solomon, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to Mick, Nicolette, and Juan for making this very easy. Thank you to you all. I feel like I should tell you to have another glass of wine and keep passing the bottles around. This is extraordinary, this project that you've done, and it's just wild to see the functions of the hotel disaggregated in this way and built into particular units or clusters. I was remarking before I came up that I'm glad you didn't reproduce Hudson Yards, and it seems like, in fact, you produced the opposite of Hudson Yards, and I'm really, really impressed. I also joked that if you've seen the Grand Budapest Hotel and Pretty Woman, you should be fine with this talk. So we're on the same page, and there'll be a lot for you. All right. To it. Wes Anderson's 2015 film, The Grand Budapest Hotel, is an incisive critique of the workings of the modern way station, envisioned on screen as a vast Eastern European factory producing pleasure, excitement, and deep satisfaction for the guest. The concierge at the center of this production, the film and the work of the hotel, is the inimitable Gustav H., who is erudite and handsome, over-perfumed, tailored to the nines, and ever eager to satisfy his clientele, no matter how outlandish their requests. The plot of the film is about a concierge who comes alive, a veritable Pinocchio, becoming suddenly and surprisingly more than his mechanical function within the institution. The transformation of Gustav H. from a detail of the luxe Grand Budapest into something else into a human being involves the bestowal of a painting in the high Renaissance style named Boy with Apple. As the film unspools, we learn that the famous painting was once locked away on the top floor of a private mansion owned by a wealthy widow. When she died on the eve of World War II, it was assumed that the painting would be passed along to her grasping nephew. But she instead bequeathed her fortune to Gustav, the bottle-blonde hotel concierge who'd been her lover of many years. Their affair staged in her hotel room whenever she visited the Grand Budapest. Of course, the widow's family refused to accept this shocking adjustment of her will, and the lawyer who managed the widow's estate soon disappeared under vexing, violent circumstances. Desperate, as you may know, Gustav was left to steal the painting, secreting it across European borders, rapidly militarizing for the coming conflict. Falsely accused of the widow's murder, incarcerated and reduced to a shabby state, Gustav escaped the prison using a spoon, tunneling out of the yard, and then relies on a hidden network of concierges to seek proof of his innocence and reclaim Boy with Apple. Beyond its dissection of the film, the film is a clever parody of the fetish for high art, because the painting, Boy with Apple, is a ridiculous, entirely over-the-top mockery of the sort of effete Baroque portraiture of centuries past. In fact, produced by an artist to look like or to mimic the high Renaissance style. Gustav H. is, quite like the painting, recognizable but outlandish. His manners, his sociality are shaped by his work in the bowels of the massive hotel. In the end, Gustav is shot dead by the Gestapo. Rescued from his lover's family, Boy with Apple is hung in the great entryway of the Grand Budapest, a switching point for myriad publics and privates. Priceless art worth dying for is thus turned into a mere backdrop for the everyday comings and goings of countless strangers. Who stops, the film asks, to look at the art behind the front desk? No one, is the unstated answer. What better place then to mount and hide a masterpiece but on the wall behind the desk clerk, where every single guest of the hotel would see it, whether they sought it out or not, and mistake it for mass-produced art. They would see the clerk in the same way. In the age of mechanical reproduction, every hotel is a reminder of another such place, and every piece of art, every concierge is an echo, too. Like Boy with Apple, they fade into the backdrop, reduced to pure function whenever the guest enters. So Anderson's film was released as we, my co-author Caroline Levander and I, were editing the final manuscript of Hotel Life, the story of a place where anything can happen. And in between line edits and collaborative phone calls, we took a moment to watch the film, found even more time to discuss it, and then decided to add a paragraph or two to the coda of the book. And up against the deadline, we wrote this. Deftly managed by Gustav, the Grand Budapest is a kaleidoscope of places and times and affects and themes and experiences. It is everything to its guests, even as it is set in its own time and space, and even as it is reproduced elsewhere, a perfect copy. Its curator and protector, Gustav H., was the man whose singular gift was the ability to extend into the present that which had vanished a long time ago. The hotel that those aged patrons who entered the Grand Budapest's environments believed in and sought after year and year, regardless of war, changes in personal fortune, and the inevitable vicissitudes of aging and infirmity. And yet, in the end, Monsieur Gustav is not unique but a type, a member of the Society of Crossed Keys, a brotherhood of concierges, all managing other versions of the Grand Budapest, each perfectly capable of getting whatever the guest wants or needs. So I'm sure while you were designing this lovely project, there were a few things that you added like at the last minute, like text, photograph, something like, what if we did this? So that paragraph was what we did in the book. We'd already read 2 versions of the copy edits. The film had just barely come out. We read it and we were like, let's throw Gustav H. in the end. So as is often the case, you have some time to reflect, right, after you've done something like that. So what we stressed in 2014 was that Gustav was a conduit to the past, to the older function of the hotel. He recruited guests to the Grand Budapest through that charming nostalgia, reminding them of past grandeur. But in the decades since, we've kept returning to the film. And now, 10 years later, we note what I used at the opening, the fairy tale emergence of Gustav H. as an autonomous man born of the Grand Budapest. In his moment of great crisis, he turns to the Society of Crossed Keys, the network of so many hotels that are eerily just like the Grand Budapest, all embodied by figures who rhyme with, if not repeat, Gustav's servile mannerisms. When the members of the society respond with support, it is because Gustav H. has been emancipated by the gift of Boy with Apple, the painting which has cost him a job but earned him a new place in the world. He is treated like a guest and shown only gracious consideration as he struggles to stay alive and retain the painting that gives him life. As is true in so much of folklore, the hero's ending has consequences. Gustav's removal as concierge drains the life from the Grand Budapest, and his death diminishes the painting, which is forgotten as the taste for the high Renaissance style fades. Hotel life, the story of a place where anything can happen, is an exfoliation of the distributive function of the modern hotel. There are, we noted therein, at least two features of this structure. The first and perhaps most straightforward is the offering of rentable space represented by the guest room, a cool oasis of privacy in an overheated public desert. The second is the solicitation of need and the provision of requirement represented by the welcoming lobby and by the concierge, eager to direct, to procure, to intuit, and by the uniformed hotel staff, always on the lookout for a question or a raised hand signaling a request, or waiting for a phone call from a guest room at the front desk. These two functions often come together, of course, because that private rentable space is advertised as a laboratory for self-experimentation and personal discovery. You probably know this painting. This is Western Motel, 1957 by Edward Hopper, one of the most enigmatic portraits of the interior life of a hotel space. So it's up here just so you don't have to look at me for the next couple of minutes. Our closing words in hotel life are worth repeating here. So hotel space, we wrote, is at once flexible and firm, junk space and fetishized. It can, on the one hand, enable imaginative leaps, unprecedented in individual guests' lived experiences, and on the other hand, deliver pre-digested temporary spaces, both mind-numbingly canned and familiar. It can, too, make impossible for you to tell the difference. In any case, it delivers life form and experience that is fluid and ever-changing, and that feels, at times, shockingly new. It wants to be marketed, to be rated, to be celebrated as restorative, as healing, and as restful, but it surely does not want to be understood in all of its big, bewildering complexity. Doing that, the task of hotel life, would be to demystify the supposed charm of submitting oneself to the authority of the glass and steel boxes that surround us, and will reveal that what we've assumed was a matter of simple self-making is in the end something far less innocent. I mean, I want to stress this point, that the hotel does not really want to be studied and has never really been the subject of a massive reform effort in the way that many other institutions. I'll repeat this theme, but it's only to say it here that this is really extraordinary, that to sort of break apart the hotel and to study it as a particular thing and to put it back together differently is something that the hotel as a structure does not necessarily want you to do. It makes this project all the more profound for me. This, of course, was what we meant when that what was restful and restorative about the hotel was that it was the clinical work of the institution, a consequence of its function as something like a cryogenic vessel. That clinical work, we stressed, needed more attention, and yet the hotel resists our focus. Indeed, alone among modern institutions, the hotel has never been comprehensively reformed or remade or identified as a problem, never been the object of determined public scrutiny or congressional campaigns. Its core functions dating back centuries are unrevised, and we believe hard to describe and even harder to see. It cloaks its secondary purpose behind a veil of necessity, presenting itself as a simple reflection of need in a big country with a lot of travelers. As Wayne Kostenbaum, another theorist of the hotel, reminds us, the hotel is unable to interpret itself. A tepid, narrow concern about sin behind closed doors has been, perhaps unsurprisingly, the chief complaint. Public awareness of the hotel's capacity to enable sexual experimentation, risk-taking, and misbehavior dates backward into the 19th century, when hoteliers and innkeepers were engaged in a struggle to control and purify the experience of an overnight stay, a struggle that pitted them against a veritable horde of adulterers, seducers, and prostitutes, burglars, and confidence men. In an act of moral stewardship, late 19th century reformers began to place Bibles in hotel rooms in the hopes that the mere presence of a good book might inspire, in a moment of great temptation, a patron to stay on the straight and narrow path to grace. This tradition of viewing the hotel as a den of iniquity, challenging the moral strength of weary and weakened travelers, continues to the present in the United States. We urge you to do away with pornography in your hotels. 2 religious leaders recently wrote in an open letter to a handful of hotel chains, because it is morally wrong to seek profit from the suffering, degradation, and corruption of others. You are placing temptation in their path, temptation for the sake of profit. These concerns, however, never came close to a swelling crusade, and that Bible found in most American hotels is the only result. And in fact, the lurid truth of what happens for some in that vivid interior is and has been a major draw. Big, boxy way stations for travelers, hotels have a unique role among post-Enlightenment institutions. Recall, if you will, the functional structure of the prison as imagined by Jeremy Bentham and as explained by Michel Foucault. A central spire, its windows shrouded in darkness, surrounded by a dense ring of cells. The design hides the gaze of an all-seeing guard, which is internalized by the prisoner. And that is the point. The prisoner learns to behave in a certain manner by imagining that he or she is always being watched by someone who has expectations for good behavior. What a contrast, we thought, with the impenetrability of the rented room, its heavy, soundproofed door marked by a peephole that looks out, not in. A hotel, Kostenbaum writes, is an arbitrary collection of human beings. Like other city structures, stores, arcades, hotels throw strangers together in chance arrangements. The hotel, he continues, is a box containing smaller boxes or cells. The grid of cells gives formal structure to the crowd's chaos. Intimate as a subway car, he adds, this unadorned structure draws together an assembly of unrelated beings, separated by walls, but gathered together in a nearness that lacks a home-like taking care. I think, again, the disaggregative function of your project here is in contrast with what Kostenbaum is saying, and I love the way in which you've provided opportunities for people to choose their own adventure using what you had as the hashtag below the second film. That theme here is separating out the clients of the hotel in really interesting ways. Kostenbaum's portrait of the hotel as an institution rich in mystery but devoid of politics missed, Caroline and I thought, the regime of care built into it. That grid of cells, as he calls it, lacks the corrective gaze of other contemporary institutions, but that doesn't mean the work of the space is banal. In too many ways, we concluded the hotel conspires to evoke the sensation of dissatisfaction, often profoundly felt, so that it can offer a soothing and satisfactory response. Recall Bentham's watchful guard in the central tower. The equivalent personality in a hotel, we decided, was the concierge. Ever ready, always on the lookout for a question, but only in the lobby when the guest sallies forth from their private territory. Only when summoned like a genie to make a wish come true. The request of the guest is a lack, a lacuna, a void of knowledge waiting to be filled. The concierge stands ready, always, and each room seemed to us not so much a cell as a private kingdom, soundproofed and secure, its only windows looking out, offering the sovereign's view of their domain. I'm willing to bet that many of you have done some writing in a hotel. Several of these paragraphs were written thusly. early in the morning with music in my headphones, curled up under the covers, my laptop unfolded. A collection of prose composed in hotels would make for a fine book on its own terms. As the most insightful appreciation of these spaces, I think, comes from those who try to access the latent creative possibilities in the curve of the walls, the anodyne thrills of a space that is engineered for anyone, engineered to make strangers feel at home, and also to remind them that they're far away from what is familiar. Poet Maya Angelou, interviewed by George Plimpton in the Paris Review in 1990, described her own singular writing process this way. I've kept a hotel room in every town I've ever lived in. I rent a hotel room for a few months. I leave my home at 6 and try to be at work by 6:30. To write, I lie across the bed so that this elbow is absolutely encrusted at the end, just rough with calluses. I never allow the hotel people to change the bed because I never sleep there. I stay until 12:30 or 1:30 in the afternoon, and then I go home and try to breathe. I look at the work around 5. I have an orderly dinner, proper, quiet, lovely dinner, and then I go back to work the next morning. Sometimes in hotels, I'll go into the room and there'll be a note on the floor which says, "Dear Miss Angelou, let us change the sheets. We think they're moldy. But I only allow them to come in empty wastebaskets. I insist that all things are taken off the walls. I don't want anything in there. I go into the room and I feel as if all of my beliefs are suspended. Nothing holds me any longer." Home, of course, is where Angelou was held in suspension, fixed by her past. The spoons in the kitchen, each with its lengthy history. The photographs on the wall, binding her to memories, to friends, to family. The dishes, the inevitable piles of dishes in the sink. All of these things bound her, each detail a memorial requiring a genuflection. No truly new thought, it seemed to say, could ever come from such a place. Creation requires an unmoored location while home roots you. Note her authority, her sovereignty in the hotel. I only allow, she declares. I insist. Nothing holds me. The hotel room, Kostenbaum writes, is familiar but subtly rearranged, never the configuration one expects. The room is filled with useful things or with evidence of use, but the room's likeness to usefulness has an alienated majesty. That comes from Emerson. That phrase, alienated majesty, was, Carolyn and I thought, intellectually intoxicating, bridging a teasing familiarity, the sensation that one is slightly out of place, and also the certainty that in this space one is enthroned as king or queen. Everywhere one sees the surround of practicality, the easy-to-please material manifestations of the hotel's drive to satisfy. We count evidence of thrift and savings and proof of value or good location, but rarely do we note the power granted to the temporary owner of that terrain. So Hotel Life was a collaboration, as you know, or a sort of co-authored book. And it was, before I talk a little bit more about how we did that, I just want to say that when I teach large group projects that are collaborative in nature, I often use, and will now publicly shame, a college partner in my French class named Chet, who was a terrible partner. And so I often tell students not to be Chet. It's a shorthand for like, carry your water, help me out here, like let's meet each other where we are. So I'm assuming that there were no Chets here. If Chet is here, then y'all know who you are. But a collaborative project requires trust and care. And I appreciate the ethos of the project and the fact that you're all there and that there's no one signature under any one part of it, that you seem to have owned it. Hotel Life, our book, began in the Monarch Bistro, the snazzy restaurant encased within the Hotel Zaza in Houston, Texas. The Monarch is technicolored with neon lights and gold chairs and a wall of verdant green plants, but it is also quiet, the usual cacophony of an ordinary restaurant muted. The Zaza, its institutional host, is infamous in the city and looms over the Mekong Fountain, mounted in the ellipse where Maine and Montrose meet over the edge of the city's museum district. It is a boutique hotel with thematically detailed rooms, some so thoroughly and outlandishly decorated that nearby Rice University once refused to book guests there. The famous prison room, number 322, for instance, with its speckled concrete floors, its brick walls, and its randomly chosen artwork, has been the subject of extensive fan debate in the fever swamps of Reddit. We met in the lobby and moved over to the Monarch, where we planned to have lunch together. Caroline, once more, is my co-author and the co-creator of Hotel Life. She is, as you surely know, a renowned literary critic with extensive publications on 19th and 20th century representations of the family, and equally impressive work on the Global South and American literature, internationally framed. At the time, though, we were primarily acting as two friends trying to come up with a topic for collaboration, because we were tired of writing books alone. Local reputation drew us to the bistro, but it was the abstraction of the hotel that made us think that a visit to the Zaza might provide inspiration. We both hoped that the swirl of patrons transiting to their rooms or on the verge of departure might shake free a good idea. And surrounded by the high modernism of the lobby, we laughingly sketched out a book about the inner and political and social life of hotels. Our laughter gave us courage. We weren't, after all, experts on the subject, not at all. We were not established scholars of the hospitality industry, and individually, our scholarly interests didn't suggest this as a likely topic. We also weren't aiming to discard our individual labors, our particular expertise and scholarly reputations. But we were veteran travelers and also unapologetic students of minutia, of the small touch, of the detail that is meant to be felt and not noticed. I wrote to Caroline as I prepared this lecture, and I asked her if she remembered that conversation. Vividly, she replied, "You said, wouldn't it be fun to write a book?" And I said, "But what about?" And you looked around and said, "Hotels." What we really wanted to do, this is me now speaking, was to carve out a new inquiry space, a space we might both imaginatively inhabit, to think about something we hadn't ever really thought about before. We were looking for the right instrument, for an angle on contemporary life that we could use to materially anchor our ongoing conversations about modernity, power, and release, about race, class, gender, and globalization, about the whole lot of things. Getting to the hotel and getting to that moment of realization in the Zaza took us a year or two of back and forth in the off hours. Sitting down that day, ticking off on our fingers those points of shared concern, we finally got it. We simply look around and recognize that we were surrounded by a weird, fascinating thing with its own culture and politics, an object that could capture everything we wanted to talk about together. So I can recall that moment of inspiration with wondrous clarity. A pleasing waitress brought us coffee with a flourish and a smile. A small clutch of brown sugar nuggets appeared on the table, along with a small, delicate spoon. Why not, we said almost together, write about that, how that happened. Outside of the public lobby, the hotel allocates nearly complete autonomy to its guests in the form of unsurveilled, borrowed space, free from supervision. The structure utilizes space to amplify and refine an explicitly mobile, cosmopolitan self, a self that imagines the private reaches of the hotel as restorative makerspaces, sites for fantastic, ever-shifting expressions of living and dying, fortune and failure, beginnings and endings, in short, of a life bigger, bolder, wilder, and more therapeutic, and sometimes even more destructive than real life. If it is the case that the best American prisons, with their short length of stay, wholesome food, recreational programs, and radio in every cell might, at first glance, resemble second-class hotels, the crucial differentiating factor is, of course, the guests' freedom to check out whenever they wish, to remain transient and mobile as inclination and necessity might dictate, and to choose, of course, what they might do behind closed doors. In the early days, we developed a shorthand for hotel life. We wanted to think about the hotel the same way that Foucault, the French philosopher and historian, once thought about other meaningful modern institutions: universities, prisons, and hospitals, where regimes of coercion, capture, and constraint dominated. So this is the lobby of the West Baden Springs Resort in Indiana. And just for contrast, let's see if I can, right? So you can see why we were, after several cups of coffee, taken by the parallel here and thinking that, in fact, we could approach the hotel as Foucault had done the prison, and that this might be a great entry point. Kostenbaum's hotel theory, with its grayscale invocation of cells, stacks and grids, and the indeterminacy of a subway car, loomed large, too. In fact, it's very interesting to me that the way you've drawn the elevator to be constructed like a subway car with hand straps, given the length of time Kostenbaum spends talking about hotels and subway cars being the same kind of random assemblage of people. And you really, I mean, you probably did this very intentionally, but we've only just met. You really are writing against or creating against Kostenbaum in several different ways here, and not just Foucault, or I guess us. But anyway, that's for dinner. In the Kostenbaum's, sorry, lost my place. But the general truth we learned is that the Hotel Zaza is, and hotels generally are, rather unlike those other bricks and mortar structures. We wished for a project to take on together. Hold on, this is the problem with these things. We wished to take on for a project to take on together, and the hotel summoned to do its work offered one to us. Our early assumption that these places would manifest only the same grim regimes, punitively shaping and producing the self, proved to be false. What we found instead was that there were almost too many facets to the hotel to count. It was a site of empire and a stage for horror, a backdrop for sexual adventure and a comforting setting for suicide, junk space and useful space, social space and antisocial space, public lobby and private room, a place for adults, a place to raise a child, a way station for temporary residents, and a landing spot for permanent runs. Hotels have been repurposed into office buildings, rehab clinics, and halfway houses, and into housing for the homeless, for refugees, and for those displaced by natural disasters, and for apartment dwellers. During COVID times, hotels were transformed into medicalized dorms, where students who tested positive could be tucked away from the rest of the community. And then, of course, they subsequently became libertine spaces, where those who'd been isolated drank and partied and sexed their way through the pandemic. Hotels, we agreed, were bundles of contradictions, simultaneously manifesting all or some of these possibilities at once. Foucault tellingly doesn't say much about the hotel. In one essay of Other Spaces, he critiques it as a crisis heterotopia, which he elaborates as a privileged or sacred space reserved for individuals who are in a state of crisis. Formally, the hotel offers ostensibly temporary space to individuals who are travelers in state of need, far from home and lacking shelter. By way of illustration, though, Foucault describes the hotel as a logical, if not inevitable, site of a virgin's deflowering, marking that event as an ancestral theme and the private space of the bed as the place where the crisis of sexual innocence, a temporary crisis as he describes it, arriving at a specific moment and sure to pass, can be resolved. Crisis heterotopias like the hotel were older things, representing the period of time before modernity. By the middle of the 19th century, Foucault continued, they were disappearing, replaced by heterotopias of deviation, where those whose behaviors marked as deviant could be appropriately warehoused, their abnormality reduced to an object of social scientific scrutiny, and serving as a referent for politically inscribed behavioral orthodoxy. Here, Foucault listed familiar subjects of his work, prisons and psychiatric hospitals, as well as a new tantalizing addition, retirement communities, which he marked as both a heterotopia of crisis and a heterotopia of deviance. After all, he noted, old age is a crisis, but also a deviance, since in our society where leisure is the rule, idleness is a kind of deviance. By this logic, the hotel was destined for revision into something rather like a medical clinic combined with the warehouse, where the aging body could be sequestered and scrutinized by a microscope as it inelegantly declined. Perhaps one reason that Foucault failed to consider in any great detail the hotel is that he imagined each heterotopia having a precise and determined function within society. Such places have one function or another, he said, talking about heterotopias, but never more than one. They might, he allowed, contain contradictions, but those contradictions never unraveled their singular purpose. So a movie theater might be an ordinary rectangular room in darkness with a screen that illuminates some other place. These are his examples. Or a garden might serve as the entire world in miniature, but those contradictions were integral to their purpose as a part of their original design. So it was too with the hotels, he thought. Still, that, Caroline and I concluded, was a mistake, given how flexible and accommodating the structure was at every step. From the human-to-human interactions to walls that slide and shift, to doors that open between rooms or seal them as tight as a drum, a space for weddings, suicides, and everything in between, the hotel defied single purpose, unless that singular purpose was simply broad-scale, eager provision of space. Provision, perhaps, though, not for everyone. Even as hotels springing up across the country offered dynamic meeting grounds for an American public, they also worked to refine and segregate the spaces they offered, creating private reserves for the elite or those with the same racial affiliations. Not surprisingly, by the mid-20th century, civil rights activists targeted the hotel as a particularly fraught site of racial exclusion, protesting against the institution's well-established policies of racial discrimination by carrying signs that demanded a room at the inn for weary white travelers. Aligning race-based refusal of services to the Christian master narrative of the hotel's founding failure to shelter the Messiah, these protesters responded to the century-long struggle that featured the hotel as a prime site of racial contestation, a struggle that began with Senator Charles Sumner's Civil Rights Act of 1875, and which continues to this day. Desegregating the hotel by race and class lingers as a challenge, and it should not surprise us to see state seizures of the hotel function in cities where surging unhoused populations require shelter, since the hotel cannot on its own easily make space for customers who cannot pay. And again, it was thinking about this particular passage that I was so struck by a lot of the work that you've done with the project, in contrast with something like Hudson Yards, which seems like it's built for really rich giants, right? Like that, the scale of this feels so interesting. The Sunset Motel sits on a desolate, transitory stretch of Route 202 in New Jersey. Hidden behind overgrown hedges, set far back from the road, the Sunset is a low-slung two-story sequence of rectangular rooms, lacking any high-gloss adornment whatsoever. The interior spaces feature high-traffic fabrics that have been trafficked, worn shower curtains that are worn, stained quilted comforters, and there are a lot of stains. The furniture is heavy, dark pine or pressed wood, inevitably mismatched and nicked with age. The parking lot's blacktop surface is cracked, and weeds spring up through fissures. Abandoned cars, their tires flattened over time, are tucked away in corners of the lot. The reception area, such as it is, takes up a small room on the first floor of an adjacent house on the property. Thick, bulletproof glass keeps customers at a distance from the proprietor, whose only engagement is to raise an eyebrow, to name a price, and to slide a key with a diamond plastic fob, worn and embossed with the number of a room through a small slit. The Sunset is barely visible from the road and shrouded in mystery, as it is meant to be. Route 202 had once been a more prominent thoroughfare, running roughly north and south between the state's mid-sized cities and zigzagging in the way of old roads between New York and Philadelphia. With a slower pace and innumerable traffic lights, 202 was rendered irrelevant for long-distance travelers with the completion of the high-speed Interstate Route 78 running parallel in 1989. But locally, that road still matters. The Sunset sits in the middle of a long stretch between nowhere and nothing, or south of the town of Somerville and just past the single police station for Branchburg, in the transitory zone between two minor nodes on a map. You might be forgiven for missing the Sunset. At the edge of the road, a simple sign, rusting metal about 6 feet tall, sits on the ground, and it looks like junk. It used to be mounted higher, the paint has faded, the fluorescent tubes have long since been emptied of anything luminescent. Reviews online say that the sunset smells like stale cigarettes, grandma, and 1974. It's supposed to generate laughter. None of those things in New Jersey smell good. In a word, the place is a relic. Still no laughter. You wouldn't miss the Fairfield Inn, though. Right next to the hedge that occludes the sunset, a newer hotel presents itself. 4 stories tall, the exterior features blocked patterns, bright fluorescent lights, and a strong roof over the carport, signaling a dry welcome even on a rainy day. It looks a lot like any other Fairfield Inn, a relatively new national chain. And if you search for it on Google, you'll probably find dozens of hotels that look just like it, and you won't be able to tell which one's on Route 202. You'll get different photographs linked to that address. All of them feature clean, brightly lit interiors with dramatic and colorful details, rooms with the daylight to spare, tastefully appointed for the budget-conscious sojourner who wants a clean and fresh space, a neutral experience on which to shadowcast innumerable imagined possibilities. Inside, the Fairfield represents a class of hotel that caters to respectable families and frugal business travelers. Emphasizing high return and modest cost, these hotels cleverly disembody the concierge function, often anticipating the question from the guest and putting the answers right where they can't be missed. Fresh fruit and cookies appear at the front desk, summoned before you even get there. Coffee service is already in the room, and a push-button machine simplifies its delivery. A wall of requirement is right by the front desk, filled with toothbrushes, medicines, snacks, and beverages. Breakfast is buffet service with a kaleidoscope of offerings from cold cereal to scrambled eggs. In many of these kinds of hotels, the presence of service staff is carefully calibrated by brand and often limited to cleanup. At the Hilton Garden Inn in Austin, Texas, a brand operating in the same lane as the Fairfield, uniformed staff provide coffee at the table with a flourish, poured in a delicate silvery carafe, but the buffet trays are replaced out of sight when servers pull aside the wall panels, revealing an interior hidden walkway, and reach when guests are not looking to supply the next abundant heaping of bacon, pancakes, or eggs. Humorously, the Fairfield on Route 202 is angled away from the road so that the lobby's bank glass walls faces away from the sunset. A tall wooden fence rings the perimeter of the Fairfield's unblemished parking lot, further obscuring its neighbors, including a shuttered pancake house, hiding the sunset too from view. The overall effect is to isolate guests from the socioeconomic indeterminacy of the past. For Foucault, of course, these are quite different structures. One is a sordid reminder of the past, the site of that proverbial virgin's deflowering, and the other a less interesting but more efficient warehouse, a clean place to store people safely. And this, I should admit now, is how I experienced them, growing up just down the road from both of these hotels. The Sunset, which I passed every morning on my way to high school, was notorious as a site for trysting, a place that would rent a room to a 17-year-old who was paying cash, where no one would blink if you returned the key a few hours later. The Fairfield, in high contrast, was where you had your extended family stay on the weekend of your wedding, as my prospective in-laws did some years ago. Right next to each other, with a wooden fence between them, the Fairfield and the Sunset seem as different as night and day, or past and present. When Caroline and I set out to envision the hotel as a concept, we came, though, to see continuities. The Sunset and the Fairfield, 2 versions of the hotel that would seem, per Foucault, to represent the divergent traditions of ancient and modern, heterotopies of crisis and deviance, share a commitment to both rest and repair, 2 functions we see at the core of the hotel, and that reparative function, however the guest defines it, is what makes the private domain of the room a chrysalis. The man behind the bulletproof glass at the Sunset wears glasses and a flannel shirt. Taciturn to a fault, he barely looks away from the TV when you enter, and he only knows you're there because a tiny bell clipped to the top of a door frame jingles when you open it. With a cursory glance over his shoulder, he asks gruffly, "How can I help you?" Not like Gustav H., but the inquiry, we now understand, serves the same purpose. I'm moving towards conclusion here. So anyone who's ever watched movies like Pretty Woman knows that hotels are the kinds of flexible spaces that offer temporary guests the opportunity for life-changing transformations. No one can be shocked that in the particular kind of space the hotel creates, there is sex and sex work along with domestic work or just work, or that the staff, the Gustav H's of the world, manage this work formally or informally, legally or illegally. Not that is when the Hollywood conception of romance includes Pretty Woman as a template. In that fairy tale story, billionaire Edward Lewis begins a week-long engagement with Vivian Ward, a hard-luck call girl brought to the Regent Beverly Wilshire, and by the film's ending, the two are a couple. To make her presentable, Vivian is given a makeover by the hotel's concierge, Bernard Thompson, who sees her transformation as his assignment. It is Thompson, played by the wonderful actor Hector Alonzado, who ensues that Vivian is well-treated, well-dressed, and ultimately prepared to play the role as Edward's accompaniment. And this, of course, is because Edward is the guest. We tend to forget, when we think of the film, that Vivian lives in a hotel too. Hers is much shabbier than the Regent Beverly Wilshire, with rooms rentable by the month. When she heads out to the Sunset Strip on the night she first meets Edward, she's behind on the rent and in danger of voiding the social contract with her hotel. Now, give me money or you're out of here, the manager tells her as she leaves for the night. We also often forget that Thompson, when he meets her, does not treat her like a guest. He takes her by the elbow, removes her from the lobby, and leads her back into her office. Mr. Lewis, he tells her, is a special customer, which entitles Vivian to some modest courtesies, but she is not a guest herself. Asking her to dress appropriately, she discloses that Edward had given her money for new clothes, but that salespersons on Rodeo Drive wouldn't accommodate her, seeing her for what she is. Bernard, intuiting Edward's desire, calls up the woman's clothing unit in a nearby department store and tells a slight lie at this moment, a very necessary lie, to ensure her revision. Introducing Vivian by phone, he says, she's a special guest. She's a niece of a very special guest. And so begins Vivian's makeover. Pretty Woman pitches itself as a Cinderella story, where the hooker with a heart of gold meets the billionaire who just needs love. But in truth, it is the story of a concierge enacting the transformation of a contracted sex worker into a more aesthetically pleasing form at the request of a client with a big wallet. It is Edward who makes this request. It is Bernard Thompson who makes it happen. And it is Edward, in the end, who finds what he is looking for and is changed. Bernard, for his part, stays exactly where he is, presiding over the lobby of the Regent Beverly Wilshire. We never learn anything about him except that he is very good at his job. And we're not clear at the end of the film whether Edward even knows his name. If a stay in a hotel is a comparatively brief and presumably voluntary affair, it is no less true that hotels narrate change or aspiration or becoming. Yes, like prisons and hospitals, they are sites of privilege and power, but they are also wildly unpredictable encounter zones, staging grounds for the enactment of race, class, and gender, and regulated transfer stations for human capital and traffic. The guest comes and goes, drawn to the hotel by both a need and a promise. Something happens during the brief moment of stillness in these spaces, something that goes well beyond a good night's sleep. And in the arrival and departure from a single fixed site, there is a river of hope or fear. No other institution in the modern world presents itself as the solution to so many different personal problems. This includes, we admit, problems as vast as the gap between the super-rich and the unhoused, between those in power and those without, between empire and the subaltern, between the promise of futurity and the certainty of desolation. It includes as well problems as small as that which confronted my co-author and me, two friends and colleagues endeavoring to find something to write about, sharing a cup of coffee and given new sightlines by the lobby's neon futurism. The hotel asks a question, eliciting the best and worst, teasing out what society represses and what the guest wants. To enter the hotel is to receive the institution's question and to commit to an answer. "How can I help you?" asked the concierge, smiling and solicitous, leaning forward graciously. Maybe it is Gustav H. reeking of perfume, a veritable lollipop in tone and taste. Maybe it is Bernard Thompson, a gracious and comforting and determined man, ready to conjure a better you. "What do you need?" asks the man behind the bulletproof glass at the Sunset on Route 202, with substantially less warmth, but just as much of a professional commitment to your wants and your needs. So compelled, you, as the guest, must summon an answer. And that's it. Or maybe that.
Thank you, Matthew. We would like to open up for questions from the hotel guests in the Tribune.
Thank you very much. This was like, in a way, this is almost what we were trying to do, in a way, with our hotel thesis. We succeeded in some ways, didn't in others. But what I found interesting is the references of these movies, these characters, if you will, and the reference in how you closed the talk, almost referencing in them in the same way as you did the man behind the bulletproof glass at the Sunset. And I was wondering how much, for you, the hotel is a place of fiction or fact in a way, where having actually worked kind of like studying the hotel or being in that environment and observing kind of the stories you gather versus the ones you can almost create by yourself just by understanding some of the ambiance and how believable or how it can kind of contribute to that story. I was wondering if in your writing you came across that kind of that boundary of understanding when actually it's fine to just kind of use your fictional mind to kind of make up these stories because they're based on something of that kind of that moment experience of the hotel.
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things I loved was the suite of rooms that you'd presented over there, which are glorious, and they're both typical of the kinds of TripAdvisor photos you might see of a really good hotel, but also better because some of those are much more interesting, especially in their variety. And I'm always fascinated by the way that hotels show rooms empty. And so they're always completely empty and unadorned, as they would be when you entered into them. And I think that's in part because they're meant to be cinematic. They're backdrops for the kinds of revisions to yourself that you might like to undertake. So they encourage you to think both about where you are now and what you need, and where you want to be and where you want to go. And sometimes the encouragement of a sort of speculative, fictional approach to what you want your life to be in the real or when you leave a hotel is the thing that the hotel uses to advertise, right? Like where do you want to go? Remember the old Holiday Inn commercials where the person's only claim to being a doctor or a surgeon or a mathematician was they'd slept in a Holiday Inn Express and as a consequence they'd woken up with a whole new set of skills. Like that's the hotel. It was one of the reasons that advertising campaign was so powerful was that it really does encapsulate the cinematic quality of the hotel, the request for you to think differently about yourself and about where you want to be. And I think the work that I only got a few minutes to spend some time with it, and I'm looking forward to doing it later and to having dinner with you all, but I think the requirement that somebody think about where you want to be, that presents a really interesting choice, right? To present the one hotel vision of different genres or flavors or themes of life that you might want to inhabit or embody. Each of them would force a potential guest to think hard about what it was potentially they wanted in life, and to imagine themselves in the future, and then to book one set of rooms or another, right? Like I particularly liked the single ladies room, which I thought was, first of all, as someone who travels a lot, I was like, man, I hope like I could rent that room, because even though I'm not a single lady, because it's like a super great narrow. They have hotels like that in New York that are just as wide as the bed, all the way to the front of the room. So anyway, I think that kind of request for you to think imaginatively about what you want to be and where you want to go is a part of it, and that makes the hotel feel very cinematic in a number of ways.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello. I guess it's a continuation of his question between the fiction and the fact. Or I was also wondering, partially is what your research process is like. Like, I wonder if you lived in the Sunset Hotel and also the hotel next to it, or things like that. And that's one part. And the other part is, I wonder how you made the selection of these hotels, or is it something personal that may lead you to the selection of these hotels and these movies, but of course, maybe something that is less personal and more observational and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So there are two things happening here, and the one is that just by virtue of like life, I'm traveling, Caroline's traveling, and we're constantly going to hotels, and we just look at stuff all the time. But when we were writing the book, we're really thinking, in some senses, about the trade literature on hotels, because we did some deep reading in trade literature. We're thinking as critics about the different genres of encounter with the hotel, which is why the book is divided up the way that it is. We're thinking about whether we have the requisite experience to write about those in a kind of knowledgeable way. And as you know from the book, in some chapters we revert to focus exclusively on fiction or on film, to think about the ways in which the hotel is imagined, even beyond the structure itself. And then in other chapters, we do something like, I don't know, kind of amateur spelunking, right? Like I'm not a trained anthropologist, neither is Caroline, but we're close noticers and we take good notes. And we, she went to a spa resort and spent a long weekend there to sort of walk through that experience herself. I checked myself into the gold suites at the Fairmont Copley in Boston to sort of experience the exclusive elite hotel lifestyle for a long weekend and took notes on it. Believe it or not, our universities put the bill for this as
Nice.
research. So, once we identified the sort of major themes that we wanted to exploit, we sort of thought about what we needed to do differently. And we were much more intentional about the choices we made in terms of where we stayed, why we stayed, when we stayed. And we did all of this work independently. Like the virtue for us of collaboration and of trust was that we never really had to be there to verify each other's work. So, Caroline would come back from a spa and we'd get on the phone and we'd spend an hour talking about what she had seen, and then we'd start to map out what we might write about in a chapter on the sort of spa function of a hotel. But I wouldn't ever say, oh, well, I've got to get to one of those too. I have to lay my eyes on that experience and try to write about it. I mean, this is the virtue of having a partner you trust, is that you don't, a partner not like Chet, is that you don't have to duplicate the work. And that for us was really important. We learned from each other from the moment we conceptualized the project until the moment we were done, because we also co-edited the page proofs and the copy edits, which meant sort of one neat bundle of words that I had made Caroline might unravel or unpack or pack differently. Or one thought that she had about something would send me looking for something else somewhere else. Since then, I should say, once you write about this material, as you all will know, like every subsequent travel experience is a way for you to test your own experiences. And like you learn more once you've done the deep thinking to write or create a larger project after, in the wake of it, by moving through hotel spaces and motel spaces. The Sunset and the Fairfield are, as I indicated in the talk, are hotels for my life. I grew up down the road from them. The Sunset was famous in my high school for being a place where you could take a partner if you were 17 and you needed to do something like that. And the Fairfield was where my in-laws stayed when I got married. So the contrast, even though they're right next to each other, is really vivid in my mind. So that's a very personal detail, and I really do believe about working from the personal and building out from there. So
Beautiful, thank you.
sure.
Hi, thank you for the lecture, and please, I'm gonna read, unfortunately. Don't you think that it's kind of funny that hotels are perceived as heterotopias, places that deviate from the rest of their surrounding, let's say, real environment, and at the same time they could define the city, be a symbol of it, and be desire of it? Why does it take place, and what is the relationship between those two, hotel and the city?
That's a great question. I mean, there are, as you know, surely movies, the Michael Fassbender movie in particular, about exhibitionism and hotels and the ways in which you're invited into a private space to make public that which is private. We talked a little bit about that in the book, but I didn't talk about it here today much at all. I'm not sure why. I've often wondered why Foucault didn't spend more time writing about hotels. And I think calling them heterotopias for him is not necessarily a positive thing. Like I don't think Foucault thinks of heterotopias as in the most positive of terms. If you think about the story of his life, the kind of sex positivity that emerges from the bathhouse in the 1980s, and the ways in which Foucault is somebody who engaged in risky behavior at the very start of the HIV/AIDS crisis in hotels, in bathhouses, didn't have access to a hotel as a place for that same experimentation, right? Like he would have been subject to the vice squad or to over-policing had he attempted to tryst in a hotel. So I think he thought of hotels in a very critical sense, and to call them heterotopias in either way, Foucault would have thought of as necessarily a bad thing, right? Like prisons for Foucault are bad in a different way than they are for more people who seek to reform the carceral state. They're bad because of what they do on the inside in terms of the way they constrain and shape the self as a consequence of our internalization of discipline. You're asking beyond that, beyond the question about heterotopia, to think about that extraordinary contradiction, which is that the private space of the hotel room is also marked by giant windows on one end of it, which necessarily make it semi-public. And I do think, this is what I was trying to say in the section on the Fairfield, that hotels think carefully about where they are, especially the big boxy hotels set up on interstates, which is the sort of fastest growing hotel type in the United States, those 5-6 story Holiday Inn Express type of hotel. They think about where they're sloped and where they're positioned so that people can't necessarily see in the room. The Fairfield Inn is at an angle, not just so that its viewers in the back see all grass, but so that people from the road can't stop and look in on the top end. And the side where the staircase is solid brick, so no one can see in the rooms on the side. But I also think, this was the verdict of the Fassbender film, that some people like to go to hotels and have their domain be viewed. If you've ever walked along the High Line, and I'm sure you did, those of you who went to New York, like if you walk through the High Line, it's like walking through someone's interior space. And you walk by like the Zaha Hadid building and others, and you're like 10 feet from someone's living room, which is beautiful. So that display function of the hotel or of whatever we call those apartment complexes on the High Line is very much a consequence of wealth in some ways, right? To show off or showcase what it is you have. And it's also for us, like not me, but us, a reflection of our commitment to voyeurism and our curiosity about what people do in their private spaces. We don't really want mirrored windows on the outside of a hotel. Like secretly, we want to be able to look in and look out. Nobody likes to be watched behind mirrored glass. So, the hotel has to have it all ways, and structurally it's built to do that. I hope that answers your question. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much. You mentioned nostalgia at the beginning of the lecture, and it's good that that image is there. Yeah, I wonder if the meaning of the hotel, or our, like, interpretation or contemporary interpretation of it is linked to an idea, to a nostalgic idea of what the actual hotel is. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. Like, in a way, it feels like that the hotel as a public place for gathering maybe is not there anymore, or it's just in certain specific types of hotels. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another great, a great question. Like, I mean, it is certainly true. I'll try to answer this question in pieces. So it's certainly true that we have witnessed profound declines in public space, especially, but not uniquely in the United States. So, you know, the absence of big piazzas or public areas in most U.S. cities is a fairly well understood phenomena. For a while, shopping malls were a kind of interior public space for people. Those are in demolition or in quiet retreat. And the hotel lobby, you know, has long been a public place, but is increasingly policed or supervised to be class-bound, if nothing else, especially in cities. And there's a passage that Foucault writes about in that essay where he talks about hotels requiring a gestural vocabulary to enter them, which I have often thought of. I don't really think a lot about Foucault, but I will today and for this talk. I've often thought about what that gestural vocabulary is, and it does seem to me that what he's talking about are race and class bound phenomena, that you walk into a space and you look or feel like you belong. And I think that that's very, very true. You know, in New York, if you think about and I can't wait to talk to you all about this at dinner, because one of the things that you did in your project was to have basically single entry points for any denizen in the hotel, no matter which unit or pod they were going into. But the structural solution to, in New York, to the legal requirement to have a certain number of apartment slots set aside for people at a lower cost has been to create separate entrances to buildings so that these entrances can be class specific, right? Like you can have one entrance on one side of a building for a non-market based housing unit baked within a larger structure that has a separate entrance and a whole separate economy for people who are rich and wealthy. So I loved the jumble of the building and the way in which your vision of the project extended the notion of the public deep into the hotel, like especially the video, the way in which you use the elevator a lot as a place where different kinds of people came together, like a subway car, was really interesting to me, because I think most hotels function very differently right now. I have taught as a joke. All of my jokes have failed here miserably, so I'm hoping that this one will work a little better. But I've taught my son when he was little how to walk. We were staying at the Sofitel in New York right after Dominique Strauss-Kahn's arrest. We had been, or a few years after, we'd been working on the book, and I wanted to stay in the Sofitel so that I could write about it. This gets back to the question of method. And of course, the Sofitel in New York is a place where like all of the staff speak French to you when you come in, and if, like me, you can't really pull off a very casual French hello to someone or make small talk in French, it's a sign that you're out of place, right? And your class function isn't right. You're vibrating at a different socioeconomic frequency than the location. So we instructed our son on how to say hello in French very quickly so that he could walk into the Sofitel and feel like he had gotten in there easily. He'd passed the class test. He'd accessed that gestural vocabulary. And I have found that to be very useful in New York in particular because of the absence of public bathrooms, that we have learned how to walk into a hotel to look like we belong and to just sort of make our way into the back spaces like we belong here generally, and then act like we're just there in the lobby waiting for someone and that we're guests in the hotel. And it's an enormously useful skill, and I like to think it's sort of hacking the class function of the hotel, even if I'm also reinforcing it in a number of ways. One does need to use the bathroom. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm moved by it. So.
Yeah, we experienced that ourselves as well. We went to New York as part of the project, and we did a research on many hotels. We visited 5 hotels every day, and we just, wow. I guess the first one we were a bit awkward there, and then we also learned how to do it, and just like sit casually on the seats and wait. But I have to say that Nian, there was one day that he was recording because we documented it all. That was the purpose of the visit. And the day after we went back, and they were like, we noticed they were looking at us, and they had noticed that Nian had been there the day before. So they were very vigilant, and there had been a robbery at the same time as he had been there. So they were very aware and, wondered if he had been the robber. So you do feel that you're like being observed the whole time. Yep. So this idea of the lobby the idea we have of what the lobby is, it feels that it's a bit lost because you're constantly.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you all know, if in the 19th century there were 2 spaces in the hotel that were marked as problem sites, one was the hotel room, about which I have already spoken at length, but the other was the lobby, which at times was a problem, especially during political campaigns where you would have like lots of fights and brawls between different partisan groups. So the hotel lobby became changed between the 19th and the 20th century to become more polished, if that's the right word, and more class-bound than it once was. And it did in the 19th century used to be slightly more open and slightly more dangerous as a consequence. It felt more like a public space on the inside.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for a wonderful talk and hitting all the points and even talking about a little bit about the collaboration. So a very appropriate coda to this work. Thank you, and thank you, people. Bye, recent graduates.
Can I just pull this out? My fingers are too big. Maybe it's there forever. Oh, I got it.